imagine the pile of materials that I've assembled over the last couple of years. And I also want to thank you for the sacrifices you're making in being away from home. And if it's any consolation, it's about 12 degrees below zero in Calgary. And just outside Sudbury is hovering around zero. So at least it's warmer here, but I really want to express my appreciation for the opportunity. I also want to, and I know others have done this, but thank the Coast Salish people for the allowing us to be on their territory today. A bit about me. I grew up in Victoria, and after I graduated from MBA school, I worked for the TD Bank through the 80s in Vancouver and Toronto, and saw the error of my ways and moved back to British Columbia from Toronto. And in the 90s, I was the senior public official responsible for BC's Freedom of Information legislation. And then over the past 15 years, I'm a lawyer working for First Nations. So a bit about me, and I'm here today to offer my personal perspective on whether this project, the Gateway Pipeline proposal, is in the public interest. And I'd like to begin by taking you to the movie theater, because last weekend I went off to see the Oscar-nominated movie Lincoln. And the most riveting scene in the movie was the scene where Congress voted on whether or not to abolish slavery. And we all knew what the ending of that movie would be, but it was nevertheless very riveting to see how various members of Congress voted and what motivated them. And sometimes the motivation was principle, sometimes it was financial, sometimes it was fear of the future, sometimes it was hope for the future. But what struck me, and I think a number in the audience, was that the members who voted on principle were often, not solely, but often the members who weren't able to run for office again, because they really had nothing to lose in terms of how they approached it, so they went by principle. I believe the Enbridge Gateway Pipeline has a lot of similarities, and ironically, I believe we already know the ending. I believe that the Conservative government of Prime Minister Hartford will ultimately approve the project and declare it safe for the environment. I believe that the next step will be that there will be court cases and protests and blockades and a variety of other steps taken, and that ultimately the pipeline won't be built. And in the process of that, there will be millions of dollars that have been wasted in getting to that decision. But just like the movie Lincoln, I think the more interesting aspect of that process is how we get there, and some of the decisions we make on the way. And I believe that in the process, this process we're engaged in, each of you has an extremely important role to play by virtue of the fact that you are amongst perhaps the only individuals who can truly say that you're independent and that you can look to make a decision based on principle. And I would urge you to make this a teachable moment for government, for politicians and corporations, and the broad public across Canada. And how would I frame that up? I would say that I would urge you to adopt and implement the principle that it should be the public who define the interest of the public. And to assist you in this task, you have the benefit of oral statements, many, most probably far more articulate and passionate than mine. of well over 1,000 individuals from diverse walks of life. They come from all income levels, all ages, all perspectives, and they've made their oral statements under oath, and they've taken and invested an enormous amount of time, as have you, to bring forward their concerns, but their perspective on what is the public interest. And what do they say? Well, they say that the interest of the public is that there should be no risk to the environment from this project. Or to put it another way, no amount of projected benefits can justify taking environmental risks. And this is clearly different than the presentations you have and will hear from the proponents and opponents who go into a balancing exercise and say, well, how can we minimize environmental risk? How can we eliminate or reduce environmental risk? Or if there is environmental risk, how can we balance that? Is there a level of benefits that warrants taking that risk? And you know, with the greatest of respect to all of the people who've made presentations and company and organizations, that's the wrong way to assess the public interest. The public interest should be defined by what the public believe is the interest. And so I would really urge you to carefully consider the oral statements. And when I did, what I found was that of the over 1,000 oral statements made so far, there's probably about 2, maybe under 10, who would argue that any amount of environmental risk is acceptable. And the 2 that I found were the mayor of Port Alberni and a former Liberal MLA, Dennis McKay. The First Nations I work with know all too well what it means to have their interests defined by somebody else and then imposed on them, whether it's the horrific treatment through the Indian residential schools or reserves or numerous provisions under the Indian Act. And so I think the panel has a real opportunity here because you're uniquely positioned, either collectively or individually, to define the interests of the public on a principled basis, on the basis that the wishes of the public, as expressed to you under oath, should be the basis for establishing what's in the public interest. And when you look at that, I think you'll find that no environmental risk is the public interest, not minimum, not safe for Canada. It's no environmental risk. And I urge you in your report to look at the public interest in that light. Thank you very much.
Mr. Barkusky, thank you for coming. You are our next speaker. You have 10 minutes to present your views to the panel. Please begin.
I defer to Ms. Brauer go first.
Just because I was setting up the camera.
Certainly, if that works better for you, let's do that. Ms. Brauer, thank you.
Okay. Start the clock. Okay. Well, my name is Celia Brauer. I have degrees and diplomas from McGill, Concordia, and Capilano universities. At present, I work as a freelance visual artist and writer. I'm also staff person and co-founder of the False Creek Watershed Society. For your information, this building we are in right now is in the False Creek Watershed. I was born in Montreal and moved to Western Canada in 1976 because I wanted to live somewhere where humans historically had less impact. But human problems have followed me. You are asking me my opinion on the Northern Gateway Pipeline and Tanker Port proposed by Enbridge. I'm going to respond by telling you my thoughts on the use and abuse of fossil fuels by humankind. Once upon a time, muscle power from humans and animals supplied most of the energy for labor. It took hundreds of slaves to build a pyramid in Egypt or raise one of the Stonehenge panels. Mankind then evolved for a few more thousand years, and in the 19th century, along came the Industrial Revolution, soon after England passed a law abolishing slavery in 1807. Energy from old sun trapped in the trees for billions of years was mined in the form of coal, oil, and gas. This was then burned as energy to perform work for humans. Machines offered far more power than human or animal muscle ever did, and machines did not talk back, have labor disputes, or mutinies. And there were many downsides. Scientist Carl Safina tells us today that there is a third more CO2 in the atmosphere than at the start of the Industrial Revolution. The current concentration is higher than it has been for several million years, and it's rising 100 times faster than at any other time in the past 650,000 years. The planet has survived much higher greenhouse gas concentrations. Civilization hasn't. And what has all this burning of old sun done to our oceans? About half of human-produced carbon dioxide has dissolved into ocean acidification. Compared to before the Industrial Revolution, the upper ocean already has 30% more hydrogen. Acidic oceans contribute to the bleaching of corals and the dissolving of shells and skeletons of sea creatures. Then there's plastic, which is made from fossil fuels, another life killer. It's cheap and useful, but it becomes waste overnight. Now in the oceans, we have obscene large and small islands of tangled plastic webs attached to abandoned fishing gear, which regularly kills sea life. Fossil fuels have essentially helped to create a world of 7 billion humans, many of whom think everything revolves around them. As cartoon character Pogo said, "We have seen the enemy and it is us." We are Homo sapiens, man the wise. We are supposed to be discussing whether what we are doing is right or wrong. So where are the moral discussions regarding fossil fuels? Well, there hardly are any. First, we look to religion. If there was something in classical religions that said we were right in exploiting fossil fuels, we decided to do this even more. If there was something that said it was wrong, we ignored it. For example, there is one sentence in the Hebrew Bible that offers man dominion over the earth. This one sentence has served as justification for centuries of planetary destruction. And yet there are hundreds of other edicts in the same book that encourage humans to practice humility over arrogance. Philosophy, the other moral discipline, is mostly concerned with matters of the human mind. The blue and green earth we live on does not figure much in philosophical discussions. Economics is another discipline that has failed to give us moral guidance. Originally, classical economics included the earth in its reckoning, but as time went on, mainstream economics quickly factored the earth out of GDP and made it an externality. As we galloped forward through the decades, population grew exponentially, and so did a resource-hungry economy. Today, pollution and waste continues to expand, and ecosystems and species shrink and disappear. At the first ever United Nations Gathering of Indigenous People in 2009, one delegate was quoted as saying, "Petroleum is the worst thing in the world. It is eating the surface of the earth, poisoning the air and water." He couldn't understand why we did this. I don't understand either. Over billions of years, life on the planet evolved on a thin layer of soil, water, and air. Sealed in the core were the poisons from the Earth's geological history. The stratosphere blocked out toxic rays from outer space. And yet, since the Industrial Revolution, humankind, in its wisdom, has pierced through both these layers to expose age-old hostile substances, which are the antithesis of life. The ongoing legacy of the Alberta tar sands is continuing to penetrate these protective layers. The total land leased to this project is 142,000 square kilometers, larger than the size of England and visible from outer space. The mining and processing of bitumen, which is so viscous it is used for paving roads, has clear-cut boreal forests and overtaken the homes of animals, fish, and First Nations. It has increased greenhouse gases as the tar sands emits as much as 4 times more carbon dioxide than conventional drilling, because 4 barrels of water, energy equal to 3 barrels of oil, and 4 tons of earth are required to extract 1 barrel of oil. Bitumen is so thick it needs chemicals added to travel in pipelines. Enbridge's proposed route, which will cross northern BC and the Great Bear Rainforest. The odds are the pipeline will rupture at some point. Bitumen is so toxic that land, animal, water, and people will suffer terribly. Then they propose to load the oil into football field-sized tankers, which will first travel through narrow channels in pristine waters. All this in an area where salmon numbers are already falling, whales are endangered, and much more sea life lies exposed. Then the tankers will spend 2 weeks traversing the turbulent Pacific Ocean. For what reason? To sell more fossil fuels to China, where some of the air is so bad people can't breathe. It seems to me that we have clearly lost our minds. My parents, who by the way were refugees from war-torn Europe, made sure to teach me right from wrong. So at a very early age, I watched gases curl out of tailpipes in motorized vehicles and thought to myself, this is wrong. We've known scientifically for decades that this is wrong, and yet we still mine, process, and use up fossil fuels even more than ever before, and man the wise has few plans to stop this. My species has been on the SS Fossil Fuels, heading straight for an iceberg for 2 centuries now, and the captains of this ship, government, business, some media, and academics, are deciding to gun the engines. And they are taking us all with them. Are these people my equals? Do they have the same vote I do? Why do they see this as absolutely right, and I see this as absolutely wrong? Maybe because they make lots of money off fossil fuel extraction and can't think straight. They perceive the earth as the new modern-day slave, just as people of old saw the exploitation of human societies as pathways to wealth. Our captains tell us not to worry, that fossil fuel extraction is good for the economy, but this is only because mankind has created the so-called economy, which says the earth doesn't have to be perceived as a precious asset. In fact, the earth as an asset is depreciating quickly and should appear as an expense on our balance sheet, but it does not. To our fearless leaders, the earth is only revenue. They don't want to believe in an ecological economy. This doesn't suit them, and so we go full steam ahead towards the iceberg. But is it right to use up excessive amounts of fossil fuels and contribute to more pollution and climate change? I don't think so. Ask a 5-year-old and they will tell you it isn't right either. I think it's a crime against humanity, and the criminals get away with it daily. The Alberta tar sands are wrong. The original exploiters were too drunk on their lucky strike to care whether what they were doing was right or wrong, and now they can't stop. Making money from enslaving the earth is wrong. Shipping tar sands by pipeline and then by tanker is wrong. Creating poisonous wastelands and adding to runaway climate change, which is breaking up ice sheets and causing unprecedented heat waves and monstrous storms, is wrong. It is all wrong. If this is the only human economy our creative society can come up with, we should be ashamed of ourselves. And here we are wasting community resources asking people whether they want this pipeline or tanker port. Hundreds of people are telling you they think this is wrong in hundreds of different ways. Why are we sitting alone in a room when this is supposed to be a public hearing? Because everyone out there knows it's wrong too, and the organizers have to hire police to help keep the peace. Is this the world we are offering our children? I am in despair that too many of our fellow humans are destroying our birthright. My late parents would be horrified if they knew what was happening to the country that gave them safe haven. The emperor has no clothes. Shame on the dominant classes for allowing the emperor to parade around on the streets, stark naked for almost 2 centuries. We have work to do, and it's not expanding the tar sands, building pipelines, and tanker ports. It's not finding new stores of fossil fuel reserves, digging deeper into the ocean, and creating more absurd economies so we can continue to think of ourselves as the center of the universe. In the 20th century, 150 million people in the civilized world have died either by violence or forced starvation. We need the economy of peace. We need to build healthy human communities. We need to rebuild and replant the earth so future generations can enjoy a world where plants and animals are plentiful, not constantly at risk. We don't need this pipeline or tanker port. It's the worst thing in the world. Our children are watching. Let's do it right.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Barkusky, we'll come to you next now.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the panel, and thank you for the work that you're doing, which is a necessary part of getting to a decision. My training and experience in the areas of economics and accounting. I have an honours degree in economics obtained at the University of Cape Town in South Africa in 1977. I did an MBA in accounting, finance, and information systems at UBC here in Vancouver in 1982, and I became a professional accountant, a CGA, in 1985. I have since studied community economic development and ecological economics through continuing education programs at Simon Fraser University and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. I'm a member of the Association of Professional Economists of BC, as well as of the CGA associations of BC and Canada. I have about 30 years work experience in Canada, a few years of experience in South Africa prior to coming here. My work experience is overwhelmingly in the private sector, and in general I tend to be supportive of a free market approach to economic policy, subject to some caveats. One of them is that the markets in question need to be competitive, and externalities need to be largely internalized. And that means all the externalities we can notice, not just the ones we care to notice, or the ones that we're politically forced to notice. When all externalities are internalized, and whether by market instruments, tax policy, law, or regulation, the market produces good results. Where the participants in the market are controlling the regulatory environment in which they operate, you may not get such good results from a free market. That's not to say government control is the answer always, but government control may be the only available counterweight to a private market system that when it isn't working because of these externalities. I understand that the task of the Joint Review Panel is to determine if the Northern Gateway Pipeline is in the public interest, and I was intrigued by the first speaker's comments about how to determine the public interest. I'm on a slightly different tack, but I'm going to think a lot about the way you suggested it. I will readily acknowledge that determining whether something is in the public interest is always difficult. I also think that to determine whether something is in the public interest economically is itself not a trivial question. I feel very strongly that economic benefit is a much broader concept than financial benefit. Traditional cost-benefit analysis says if someone benefits financially, then there's an economic benefit to the group as a whole, unless someone is losing exactly the same amount. I'm not so sure it can be simplified quite like that. I understand that's an analytical shortcut necessary to get results, but we need to be aware of the logical flaws of the steps we're taking. And similarly, I think economic costs are a much broader category than financial costs. You need to really figure out what is a cost and try and count them all. And questions of distribution over members of human society matter greatly and are also complex. A question that always gets political press: who gains and who loses? So we need to pay attention to that part of it too when we're saying something is in the public interest. And then there's also the difficult question, which we really all tend to avoid, which is interspecies ethics. I think it's kind of treated as axiomatic that humans count and animals don't. I think that's too simplistic for a world of ecological interdependence. And it also contradicts our view that we're a humane and not a barbaric society, treating living animals no different from rocks and inanimate objects. I think is really philosophically flawed, ethically flawed. But one of the trickiest ones that we've got the tools to deal with, we just don't tend to deal with them very well, is intertemporal efficiency, getting the time dimension right. And so we need to be able to assess intertemporal efficiency as well as intertemporal equity. That's fairness as well as efficiency in the sense of not wasting what is scarce. And we talk about productivity a lot in macroeconomics, and we always assume everybody knows it means labor productivity. But in fact, productivity is more than just labor productivity. Productivity is efficient use of anything that is scarce. And if we're confused about what is scarce, then we're going to be measuring the wrong kinds of productivity. And if we're going to have the wrong versions of wealth, we'll be maximizing the wrong thing. So there's also an important point, I think, to be noted in regard to assessment of the long-run economic benefits or costs of projects, that we need to properly reckon with the concept of irreversibility and future option values. If something is reversible, you can take higher risks than when it's not reversible. When it's irreversible, the bar has to be moved on to a much higher precautionary standard. So those things have to be considered to get a proper economic evaluation. And traditional economic assessments based on the GNP, GDP impact, and the number of jobs created, are exceptionally crude ways of assessing economic benefits. I had to repeat that because it's just so important. We do that because we haven't got anything better, just like we used to treat certain diseases with leeches in the 18th century because medicine hadn't advanced to the level it has today. But when we look back at those forms of medical treatment, we say they were stupid and barbaric and they were inadequate. And I think some of the ways in which we assess economic benefit are the same way. GDP does not measure many things that really matter. Depletion of natural capital perhaps being the most important one. Potential irreversibility of the losses of ecosystem structural integrity, ecosystem functional resilience and biodiversity, and all the implications thereof. The horizontal distributional equity that I referred to, and the vertical intergenerational distributional equity, and then of course interspecies equity. GDP in certain instances can add costs and benefits together. Now, if we did anything like that in private sector enterprise accounting, we'd flunk the accountant, get rid of them. But national income accounting is not as sophisticated in that sense. It's got a more ambitious task, so the gap perhaps be excused for that, but it's got a long way to go. And GDP, of course, ignores non-market transactions and treats all government spending, for example, by definition producing net benefits. So we say the benefits are equal to what we spend, which is not a very good way of tracking waste. So the argument that a mega project will increase GDP really doesn't prove anything. It's an interesting first opening statement, but it's just the beginning of the analysis, not by no means the end. Numerous economists I've been reading, Robin Allen, Mark Eliasson, Jeff Rubin, Mark Lee, none of whom I know of as being especially heterodox, certainly not people who parade around the label of ecological economist, have seriously questioned the proponent's assertion that the NGP is in the public interest from an economic point of view. One unique distributional issue is the question of the role of the First Nations who are in the path of this pipeline. And I happen to have some quite close at hand knowledge that the coastal communities are absolutely against this project. I really don't think any realistic observer could say there's any support. So the project needs to be evaluated over its lifetime, and lifetime in this context is not some short, arbitrarily chosen time period based on the technical or economic obsolescence of the equipment being installed. It's the lifetime of all the impacts of the project. That's the relevant lifespan over which the benefits must be assessed. The assessment of impacts must include all impacts on ecosystem structural integrity, ecosystem functional resilience and biodiversity, and in both terrestrial and marine biomes, and over all periods in which such impacts may occur. And the assessment of impacts must include an assessment of the differential impact of this project on climate change and ocean acidification. I'm not at the time or resources to attempt to undertake such a comprehensive study myself. My strong intuition is that a proper comprehensive study of the type I believe is necessary to answer the question, is this project in the public interest, conducted in a rigorous fashion, will unfortunately produce a negative answer. Thank you.
Thank you to each of you for